What brought you to the point where you could say, as you said in that same interview, I'm the best rock and roll drummer in the world? That's a very confident statement.
I am.
Okay. So what gave you the confidence then, Ringo?
Well, I had that a long time ago. It's just that they started asking me about it now.
There are 4 drummers on the Beatles' music. Ringo's not one of them.
Hey friends, it's Mike. It's Friday, September 23rd, 2022. It's been a while since I've done a video, and the main reason for that is bullet number 1 on the chart. Our grandson was born last month. He's about 7 weeks old, and so we have been spending a lot of time with the baby and being involved with family get-togethers and family commitments, and it has been a fabulous experience. Bullet number 2 on the chart, I have 2 interviews coming up in early October, one with Mark Devlin. Mark sent me an email and said, Mike, I'd like you to come back on the show, and what would you like to talk about? And I said to Mark, let's talk about the Beatles, because I think it's time to do a summary of everything that I've gone through over the last 6 years. We're certainly not going to pack 6 years into 2 hours, but I'm going to try to cover as much ground as I possibly can. I also have an interview with Jesse Howell. I'll be back on Jesse's show. The last time I was on Jesse's program, I guess it was about maybe 6 months ago, and it ran for over 3 hours, and it was a fabulous discussion, so I'm looking forward to that as well. I have a cameo role as an interviewer in the movie version of Dave Kornblum and R. Scott's Fall the Musical, and so I have to do some voiceovers, and I'm hoping to get to that either next week or the week after. So Dave, if you're listening in, it is on my list of things to do, and I will get it done. My Beatles research will be referenced in 2 Beatle books which are currently underway. One of the authors wrote me and asked me if I wouldn't mind answering 10 questions that had to do with the McCartney/Beatles conspiracy, and I did do that. And I am looking forward to reading both books. I have an upcoming presentation that has to do with my colleague Sally presenting her work and her research with regard to Billy's ties and connections into Pan. And I've mentioned this a couple of times going back in, I guess, 2 or 3 videos. We were thinking that we could get the presentation out sooner more than later, but I had a lot of family stuff going on, good stuff, especially with the baby being born. And Sally was finding that as she was looking deeper into the mythology and deeper into the occult aspects of the mythology, that there was going to be more to present, and thus she needed more time to pull the presentation together. So I'm thinking we should probably have it out within the next 30 to 60 days. I've got to sit down with Sally. I have to take another run through what it is that she has brought together. We did talk about 2 weeks ago, and I think it's going to be a fabulous presentation. I really do. And she has also spent an enormous amount of time decoding the gematria within memoirs. Now, this is something that I haven't really touched. I've gone into the numerology, but Sally is actually taking a look at phrases contained within memoirs. It's another layer of encoding. And she began decoding it. And it's quite an eye-opener what she has found. And she shared some of her findings with Tom, and Tom sent a PDF to both Sally and I, and we can see here 369. And Tom talks about if 3, 6, and 9 are more energetically charged than most numbers, the new edition of the Memoirs of Billy Shears has just been charged up even higher than before. And what Tom sent over is much longer than this. I just cut this blurb out here. And again, 3, 6, and 9, I've mentioned this so many times, very, very important numbers. And I should mention that the revisions in this version, or this edition of Memoirs, which is going to be released tomorrow, September 24th, 2022, are not earth-shattering. They're more subtle. They have to do with numerology and the gematria aspect of the encoding. But I do want to point out the date, because the date is very important. September 24th, 2022. A lot of people still believe that numbers don't mean anything, but the controllers, they paint by the numbers. And I've mentioned this many times in my presentations. So if we take a look at September 24th, 2022, September is the 9th month, so we have 9. 2 plus 4 is 6, and 2022, 3 times 2 equals 6. So 966, and we can reduce 966 down to 12, and we can reduce 12 down to 3. We can also take the 966 and we can flip the 6's and get 999, and we can also flip the 9 and get 666. And so we could see that that date is encoded with 3, 6, and 9. Another presentation that I actually started working on a number of months ago, I'm about 90% done, covers the esoteric passages contained within the footnotes of memoirs. And I think you're going to find that very interesting, and I'm going to try to get that out within the next 2 months or so. I want to get Sally's Pan presentation done first, and then I'll release the esoteric passages. Okay, so that covers the updates, what's on the burner right now. And let's move to the next slide, and let's talk about the topics I'm going to cover specifically in this video. Okay, so the first topic is The Queen is Dead. It's one chart. It has nothing to do with the Beatles, but it is another example that I wanted to show where those within the pyramid of power, the controllers, use numbers and astrological events to determine their next move on the chessboard. The second topic is titled The Frustrated Paulists, and this has to do with a specific segment within the Paul is Dead community. I call them the Justice Leaguers. Some may refer to it as Justice for Paul McCartney, where they want so badly to believe in the Cinderella story. They want to believe that 4 working class lads out of Liverpool connected with a record store owner, Brian Epstein, who then got them signed to a major record label, EMI, under the tutelage of George Martin. And then the lads experience unprecedented fame and fortune. And this group is extremely frustrated and angry still about my presentation that I uploaded 2.5 years ago. Did the Beatles write all their own music? And what I want to take you through is what needs to get done on their part to prove that the Beatles did write all their own music and the Beatles did play on all the recorded tracks. Okay, so I will spend some time taking you through that topic. The third topic, which actually was the original primary discussion for this video, it has now dropped to the number 3 position, is a postscript to the video I did about the Beatles and the BBC recordings. And I received a great comment from a subscriber who asked, why so many covers and what was the purpose of doing all those covers on the BBC? So I'll give you my take on why that was done. Topic number 4 I added today because it was an email that came in from a listener who took a look at a recent Billy video, and they did screen captures of occult symbolism and numbers that took place in the video. And again, there are still folks that don't believe the numbers mean anything. They have a hard time getting their heads wrapped around it, but I know I sound like a broken record, but the controllers paint by the numbers. Numbers are very important to them. So I'm going to show you some of the screen captures that Adrienne sent over, and you can take a look for yourself. Next, I'm going to show you 2 great videos which compare the mannerisms between Billy and Vivian Stanshall. And I'm talking about the Vivian Stanshall of the Bonzos. That's the version of Stanshall that Billy played. And he was in the Bonzos with Neil Innes. There's another version of Stanshall. His first name is Victor, and I'm going to show you some compare pictures when we get to that segment of the presentation. And going back several months ago, maybe even a year ago, there was a video I did where I suggested at the very tail end of the presentation that maybe Greg Masters of Idle Race, that was a band that Jeff Lynne was part of, perhaps Greg played a version of Stanshall as well. But for sure, there were two versions. There was the Billy version in the Bonzos, and there was Victor, who played Stan Shaw outside of the Bonzos. And Victor was the very tall, lanky, 6'3" version of Vivian. And again, I'll show you some slides and you'll see what I'm talking about. Topic number 6, the deep state and the dark occult, came about based upon an interview that Mark Devlin did. Mark sent me a link to the interview where he had a guest on his show that specializes in the occult aspect of the Beatles. This is a person that I have also had on my show, and there was some dialogue and comments made by the guest that I felt I needed to address because they had name dropped my name in the show. So when we get there, I'll explain more. Topic number 7 has to do with copyright and privacy protection as it pertains to my content. And again, when we get to that segment of the presentation, I'll take you into more detail. And so with that, let's talk about the Queen being dead. Okay, so with the Queen, it's all by the numbers, so she dies or passes away. At least that's what we're told. Some people believe she died years ago on September 8th, and she was 96 years old. So if we take a look at the number 96, we get the number 6. If we flip the 6, we get 99. 9 plus 9 is 18. We get 9. We can also take the 9 and flip it and make it a 6, and we get 2 6s, 66. 6 plus 6 is 12. 1 plus 2 equals 3. Or we have 3, 6, 9 again. And then, as with Billy, as he's moving on, we see the number 10, which is representative of completion and new beginnings. So the day after the Queen dies, September 9th, the UK enters a 10-day mourning period, during which no government announcements will be made. The King, this is King Charles, addresses the nation at 6 p.m. On September 10th, we have a full moon, or the harvest moon. Charles, who is 73, 7 plus 3 equals 10, is formally proclaimed king after the Accession Council meets at 10 a.m. On September 11th, and remember, the Pyramid of Power looks at September 11th as a day of war. And a day of war does not mean physical war. It can mean psychological war. It can mean a war against culture, as an example. So on September 11th, Charles hosted the diplomatic reception of the century at Buckingham Palace. It was a state reception on a scale unprecedented in living memory. And this is important wording because when they say it's on a scale that is unprecedented in living memory, what they are telling us is there is worldwide interlock. And this goes to show you where the crown sits within the Pyramid of Power. Okay, so the Queen dies, and then we start seeing the number 10. Completion and new beginnings. So what this is telling us is the new order is proceeding. I know a lot of people don't want to hear that, but this is what they are telegraphing for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, and who have at least some semblance of an understanding about what the numbers mean. And it doesn't matter whether you believe in numbers. It matters what they believe, because they're the ones running the show. And they're going to continue to run the show until people wake up. And with that, let's move to the next topic, and let me explain how it is that those that want to embrace the Beatles Cinderella story can prove that the Beatles wrote all their own music and played on all of their recorded tracks. Okay, so for those of you who follow my work, you know that through my research, I have concluded that the Beatles did not write all their own music, and they did not play on all of the recorded tracks, the album tracks and the singles. And this is particularly true when we discuss the biological Paul period. This would be the years 1962 through 1966. And then after 1966, the Billy era, 67 through 1970, John Lennon and George Harrison contributed more to the song content and played more on the recorded tracks. However, the Beatles still used outside songwriters or ghostwriters and studio musicians to create the albums. And for those who are not familiar with my presentation, it's 4.5 hours. Did the Beatles write all their own music? I will leave a link down below and you can watch it. I suggest watching it in 1-hour chunks, and I take you step by step how it is I came to the conclusion that they didn't write all their own music and they didn't play on all of their recorded tracks. Now, I released a presentation on April 1st, 2020, which is April Fool's Day, and I did this intentionally because it links to the Fool card of the tarot deck. And the characteristics of the Fool card is somebody that is adventurous, it's somebody that pursues opportunity, and somebody that doesn't mind taking risk. And these are all attributes that Billy had to possess in order for him to make the decision to take on the role of Paul McCartney. He had to conclude that the upside far outweighed the downside. And that's why I tied it to April Fool's Day. And I knew that Billy would get it. And those within his inner circle would understand why I uploaded the presentation on that day. So when I uploaded it 2.5 years ago, it sent a shock wave through the Paul is Dead community. And the reason why it sent a shock wave was because up until that point, most Paul is Dead researchers only focused on Billy replacing Paul. They never touched the bio-Paul period. They never questioned the full official narrative. And so when I did that, it turned the Paul is Dead community upside down on its head. Because most researchers want to believe that John Lennon and Paul McCartney were these brilliant, prolific songwriters. They want to believe the official narrative. They want to believe the Cinderella story. And who doesn't want to believe it? It's a great story. I used to believe it. It wasn't until I watched the documentary, Deconstructing Rubber Soul, that I realized something was very off about the Rubber Soul narrative, where we are told that the Beatles had no backlog of music and they were going to record, or they did record, 16 songs in 30 days, which means they came in with a blank sheet of paper. They had to write, rehearse, arrange, record, and mix 16 songs in 30 days. Being a musician myself and a songwriter, and having spent time recording, that didn't seem realistic to me. In fact, it seemed extremely far-fetched. So when I questioned the entire timeline, not just that piece where Billy replaced biological Paul, when I went back and I started questioning, were the Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, but specifically John Lennon and Paul McCartney, because those were the two that were put on the pedestal as songwriting geniuses. Once I questioned that, in the minds of the Paul is Dead community, I walked off the reservation. I went after a sacred cow. And that's when I realized it was a religion. These people who call themselves researchers and investigators, they weren't that at all. They really didn't want to pursue the truth. They wanted to embrace this story, this feel-good story. They really liked it. It resonated with them, and they did not want to let go. So I looked at everything, and I haven't stopped. In fact, this presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music?, isn't the only presentation where I dig into their history. I have another presentation that deals with the 1960 through 1963 period, when it all got started. And that doesn't make any sense either. And so for 2.5 years, the Beatle worshippers, the Paulists, have been very frustrated and very angry, and they believe their way of rectifying the situation, to put things back where it used to be, to put the Cinderella story back underneath the spotlight in front of everybody, is to attack me, which is a failed approach. It's a very bad approach. Here's the problem that the naysayers have, and this is why they think attacking me puts the official narrative, the feel-good story, back where it belongs. They cannot prove the Beatles wrote all their own music and played on all of the recorded tracks. They cannot prove it. Why? Because there is no direct evidence or even solid circumstantial evidence that the Beatles wrote all their own music and played on all their recorded tracks. The non-critical thinkers, the Beatle worshippers, resort to personal attacks and childish behavior, rants, name-calling, trolling, half-baked, quote, analysis, to try to get things where they believe it needs to be, to prop the official narrative back up, to put the Cinderella story back where they believe it needs to be. And so personal attacks against me and childish behavior directed at me, they think is going to fix everything. It's not. If you want to fix what you think is broken, then you need to prove they wrote all their own music and played on the recorded tracks. Everything the contrarians believe is the result of being conditioned, indoctrinated, and brainwashed by the official narrative. Again, what I refer to as the Cinderella story. And because of this conditioning, a cult mentality prevails. They are worshiping minions of fabricated gods. And I'm not just talking about the Beatles. We see this everywhere in society. People worship artists, bands, celebrities, politicians, Silicon Valley, quote, icons. It's everywhere. But the one thing the contrarians, the Paulists, have succeeded in is sending more people my way to watch my content. It's called the Streisand Effect. The Streisand Effect is when you tell people not to do something and the opposite happens. So you're telling them, don't look there, and then the people you're telling not to look say, well, why don't they want me to look over there? Let's go take a look. And as a result, this presentation, did the Beatles write all their own music? Between my two channels, my main channel and my Paul is Dead channel, over 150,000 views and a significant increase in channel subscribers. So for those that believe I'm wrong, your task is very simple. You need to prove the Beatles wrote all their own music and played on all the recorded tracks. And in the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you that even though that's a very simple premise at face value, it's going to be extremely difficult, and I'm going to say impossible, to prove.
They burned their records and spit on their images. But before they burned the records, they had to buy them.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did. I was just saying it as a fact. I was using expressions on things that I just read.
The Passover plot speculates that the Bible is a hoax and that Jesus didn't die on the cross. Jesus survived, and in order to create a new religion with himself as the Messiah, he made people believe that he'd risen from the dead.
He said to me once that the children of 2000 will be listening to the Beatles.
By 2012, the masses will be where we are today, and Paul should be Jesus by then.
By 2012, the masses will be where we are today, and Paul should be Jesus by then.
And so with that, let's move to the next slide and listen to a clip of Ringo Starr from 1981 in an interview with Tom Snyder. Okay, with this clip, this is a great example of the truth being hidden in plain sight. In this clip, we're going to hear Ringo talk about the writers and not associate the writers with John Lennon and Paul McCartney. He talks about the writers as a standalone entity. But when he talks about the singers, he does associate the singing with John and Paul. So let's take a listen.
What brought you to the point where you could say, as you said in that same interview, I'm the best rock and roll drummer in the world? That's a very confident statement.
I am.
Okay. So what gave you the confidence then, Ringo?
Well, I had that a long time ago. It's just that they started asking me about it now. I mean, at the beginning, I mean, because of the songwriters, which is a very powerful force in the Beatles, and John and Paul mainly as the singers, and I was just playing the drums and nodding my head so I'd get noticed.
Because of the songwriters, which is a very powerful force in the Beatles, and John and Paul mainly as the singers, and I was just playing the drums and nodding my head so I'd get noticed.
And doing one song, you know, there was never anything really said about the drummer. You know, and if you look at Charlie Watts and the Stones, I mean, there's never anything really said. It's like, oh, it's Charlie Watts. And, you know, he's an amazing drummer. But, you know, the drummers tended to not get the writing. And
which is curious because usually the drummer is the driving force of the band.
It is the driving force, but when you have songwriters of that caliber and singers, I mean, I'd much prefer to talk about the songs and the writers more than, you know, some sort of paradiddle I could do.
So it's interesting because not only does he not associate John and Paul as the writers once, but he does it twice. And the second time, what they did with the visuals was to put up the clip, the Sgt. Pepper clip, where they show Paul and John. And that's the imagery association with the word writers. So they're looking for the audience, the listener, to make the association. Ringo is not making it, and he is not making it intentionally. This is a form of masterfully speaking. Because of people's conditioning, the indoctrination and the brainwashing, and I know there are people right now who are thinking this. They're saying, well, of course, it's John Lennon and Paul McCartney that he's talking about. Who else could it be? Well, if it were John Lennon and Paul McCartney that he was talking about as the writers, he would have said, with John and Paul being the songwriters that they are and being such a driving force within the Beatles, that would have been a logical and appropriate way to describe John Lennon and Paul McCartney if they were the writers. But Ringo never makes that association. He never makes that connection. And I will argue it's intentional. It's a form of masterful speaking. It is the truth hidden in plain sight. And they know, and when I talk about they, I'm talking about those that are in the club. They know that the listener will make the association on their behalf, on behalf of the controllers, because of people's conditioning, their indoctrination, and their brainwashing. And people do this all the time. They fill in the blanks. They fill in the blanks with what it is they want to hear. And in this case, what people want to hear is John Lennon and Paul McCartney were great songwriters and a driving force behind the Beatles. But Ringo never says it. He lets the listener, the conditioned individual sitting in front of the television set or the computer screen, to make the connection. And when the indoctrinated individual jumps to conclusions by filling in the blanks, making assumptions based upon conditioning, which is exactly what's going on here in this clip, because I know there are so many people that are believing that Ringo is specifically talking about John Lennon and Paul McCartney, when in fact he never mentions their name in connection with the writing. And when people do this, they are unwittingly contributing to the further enablement of the official narrative, of the agenda of the controllers, because the controllers cannot do this on their own. They need a lot of help. And they're getting that help from the brainwashed masses who have had their beliefs and what they think they know completely shaped by all of these narratives that are all over the place. Again, it's not just the Beatles. It's everything. The controllers have essentially inserted filters into people's minds. And that's why there's a lack of critical thinking. People can no longer discern. Most people cannot discern. They just run with whatever is fed to them. In any case, let's move to slide number 6. And what I want to do is to show you the cover of George Harrison's last album, Brainwashed. And there are some significant clues on that album cover. So let's take a look at that now. Okay, so here's George Harrison's last album, which is titled Brainwashed. And there is a reason why he titled his last album Brainwashed. George was going to depart with at least some semblance of the truth. And so let's take a look at what he has on this album cover. There are 4 things that I picked out. There's probably more, but these are the 4 that stood out. Let's start here on the right. 5 crash dummies. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This represents the Beatles. So the 4 original Beatles, starting with Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, and then, of course, Billy. Then George is showing on their laps a TV set. And what does that symbolize? It's brainwashing and mind control, what I just talked about in the previous chart with Ringo. Okay, so 5 crash dummies representing the 5 Beatles and a TV set. Brainwashing and mind control. Then take a look at what we see here, the shadows. Well, the shadowing of the dummies does not show 5, it shows 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So what is George telling us? There were 5 Beatles. When we include Billy, and we should include Billy, he was a Beatle. But the official narrative tells us there were 4, starting in 1962. Right? We're not going to talk about the Hamburg era with Stu Sutcliffe and Pete Best. So 5, and then you are told there were 4. Because we're not going to tell you about Billy, we're just going to tell you that that's Paul McCartney. And then we see the stars, or the pentagrams. If we go up to the yellow box, I have 2 definitions. One definition comes to us from a dictionary, and the second one comes to us from the Thelema site. So the dictionary definition, a pentagram is a 5-pointed star that is formed by drawing a continuous line in 5 straight segments, often used as a mystic and magical symbol. So even the dictionary definition talks about a pentagram being used as a mystic and magical symbol. Then the definition from the Thelema site, and I'll put the link down below. You can take a look for yourself. The greater ritual of the pentagram, there is also a lesser ritual of the pentagram, is a fundamental ritual of ceremonial and Thelemic magic. It was originally taught by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn as a banishing ritual. So what is George telling us? George is telling us that the Beatles were an occulted entity, that they were immersed in the occult. And I have spent many hours in many presentations showing the occult symbolism all around the Beatles, including the numbers. So, with the pentagram being displayed, especially prominently on the TV screen, we're talking about magic. We're talking about ritual. We're talking about brainwashing and mind control. We're talking about the Beatles being a psychological operation. That is what I believe George is depicting on this album cover. And it's very interesting that he used crash dummies to represent the Beatles. I'll let you think about that. Now with the next slide, slide number 7, I'm going to circle back and explain my logic as to why the Paulists cannot prove that the Beatles wrote all their own music. So let's move to slide number 7 now. Okay, so this is slide number 1 of 6 or 7 slides where I'm going to walk you through my logic to explain why those that want to believe that the Beatles wrote all of their own music and played on all of the recorded tracks are going to have one heck of a time trying to prove it. So the official narrative tells us, and in fact this was a selling point of Peter Jackson's movie Get Back, that prior to the Get Back sessions there is no authentic film footage of the Beatles writing or recording music. And in the series of presentations that I did on Get Back, I stated that using Get Back, or the Let It Be movie, as a proof point of the Beatles' genius is dubious at best. And I'm going to revisit a slide that I had in some of those presentations to explain why I think that. And based on the official narrative, we have to believe that the most famous rock pop band of all time has no film footage documenting their writing or recording music. Yet the Beatles are one of the most filmed bands of all time. Interviews, press conferences, concerts, movies, etc. And this goes to a great point that Mike Stock made in the interview that I had with Mike, where he said there was always a camera following the Beatles. Always. Yet, no footage, no film footage of them in the studio writing songs or laying down the recorded tracks. So as an example, something that would go a long way to squashing the debate, considering the magnitude of the alleged accomplishment of recording 16 songs in 30 days for Rubber Soul, why were the Rubber Soul sessions not filmed for the historical record? Why was the genius and brilliance of one of the greatest songwriting teams not captured for posterity? Why was that not done? Filming the Rubber Soul sessions would have shown the Beatles writing all of the songs as well as playing on the recorded tracks. Yet, to the best of my knowledge, that type of footage does not exist, not only for Rubber Soul, but for any of their other albums, aside from the Get Back sessions. And again, I'm going to talk about the Get Back sessions. So the question becomes, no one thought to document their talents? They filmed them doing everything else, but no one thought to take a camera into the studio when they were writing and recording their songs. Nowhere to be found. There was a comment going back a couple of weeks ago where somebody thought they were being clever and witty. And they said, well, Mike, is there a video of you writing music and recording? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, yes. But that's not the point. I'm not the Beatles. Nobody would have any reason to video me writing music or recording music. I might do it on my own. I'm not the greatest rock band of all time. I'm not one of the greatest songwriters of all time. And so without the film footage, the only thing the official narrative has is stories, words. And that's what we're going to get more into in the upcoming slides. And so with that, let's talk a little bit about Get Back and why that is not a proof point of their ability to get things done in the studio. Okay, so let's talk about Get Back, because sometimes people will leave comments and say, well, hold on a second. In Get Back, we saw them writing and recording music. But my response to that, and I did a series of videos on the Get Back documentary, Peter Jackson's documentary, and I said it wasn't a shining moment. But the premise of the documentary, I believe, what Peter was trying to put forth, was a classic Hollywood script where the heroes persevere, they overcome adversity, and then pull through in the end. And my question is, or did they? So my takeaway from watching the documentary is that Get Back attempted to spin a lackluster outcome into a significant achievement. And so we have to go back to the original objective. When Billy took his bandmates into the Get Back sessions, the goal was to write and record 14 new songs in a little over 2 weeks, then perform 2 live shows for a TV special broadcast. And what was the end result? They performed 5 songs on a rooftop to no audience, and then released a grainy, uninspired movie and a 12-song subpar album, which Phil Spector had to put together. In fact, in one of the presentations I did on the whole Get Back documentary, I had a chart in there that quoted John Lennon as saying that he handed over a pile of shit to Phil Spector and he turned it into something. That was Lennon's opinion on the recordings that Phil Spector had to work with. And when we talk about the end result in performing 5 songs on the rooftop, that's after 30 days in the studio. And we have to remember that the Beatles, during the Get Back sessions, were a captive audience. In other words, there were no press conferences and other stuff that was going on. Their primary task for a month was to show up in the studio and attempt to write and record 14 new songs in a little over 2 weeks. And that did not happen. So the question is, with 7 years of writing and recording, so if I go back to 1962 and the Get Back sessions started in January of 1969, that's the 7 years, and they had 9 official UK albums under their belt by that time, along with stories of profound and spontaneous writing abilities, why were the Beatles unable to achieve their stated goal of 14 new songs in a little over 2 weeks? What happened to their prowess? And if we break down the 12 songs on the Let It Be album, we have to assess what was really accomplished. So 2 songs on the album were throwaways, in my opinion. Maggie May and Dig It. In fact, Billy considered them throwaways as well, because when he released Let It Be Naked in 2003, he took those songs out and he replaced them with Don't Let Me Down, which, of course, is a far, far better song. Another two songs on the Let It Be album were not recorded during the Get Back sessions. I Me Mine was one of them. That was recorded in 1970, and Across the Universe, which went back to 1968. And what a lot of people don't know is that with I Me Mine, George Harrison had about a minute and a half of a song. And Phil Spector went off and did some editing to bring the song to, I guess it's about, 2.5 to 3 minutes? So that was the type of stuff that was going on behind the scenes. In fact, in Peter Jackson's documentary, there is a version of Don't Let Me Down, and he states in the documentary that that was the recorded version of the song. That's the recorded track that ended up on the album. Only to come out later in an interview that that wasn't entirely true, because John Lennon redid the vocal afterward. It's the same thing with For You Blue. George Harrison redid the vocal afterward. Billy erased John Lennon's bass line and re-recorded the bass line for Let It Be afterward. The drums to Long and Winding Road were added later on. I think that was added in early 1970. So the point being is there was a lot of work going on beyond the Get Back sessions that went into the following year. So, in other words, an entire year had gone by, and there was still work being done on those songs. And it still didn't turn out to be a great album. By Beatles standards, it was substandard. So, with 2 throwaway songs and 2 songs that were not recorded during the Get Back sessions, that leaves us with 8 original songs from the sessions, spanning 30 days. Let It Be, Get Back, For You Blue, I've Got a Feeling, Two of Us, Dig a Pony, One After 909, which we are told was allegedly written in early 1960. Yet it doesn't appear on any Beatle album until Let It Be. I would say that One After 909, even though not one of my favorite songs, was better than some of the songs on the Beatles' first 2 albums. It certainly was better than some of the songs they did on their 4th album, Beatles for Sale, which was split, I think, 50-50 originals and covers. But, you know, the official narrative tells us that that song was written in 1960. Honestly, I don't believe that. The reason why I don't believe that is because Aleister Crowley released his Book of the Law, which is essentially the holy text of Thelema, in 1909. 1 after 909. And then, as I mentioned, there were songs and recordings that extended into 1970 before the release of the Let It Be album. And we also have to keep in mind that with the Get Back sessions, Billy Preston was instrumental during the sessions. In my opinion, without his contribution, it's possible the entire project might have been permanently shelved. Because up to the point before Billy Preston arrived, the Beatles were really struggling to put something together. And then Billy started playing the Rhodes piano, and a whole new dimension was given to the music. So I would argue that the Get Back sessions showed what the Beatles were not capable of. If we go back in time, we're told that they recorded 10 songs in one day for Please Please Me. They did 14 songs in 7 days for their second album with the Beatles. We're told they wrote and recorded from scratch 16 songs in 30 days for the Rubber Soul sessions. We're told they wrote 30 plus songs while they had their stint in India, although they weren't all there at the same time in India. Ringo left after 2 weeks, Billy after about a month, and George and John stayed in India for 2 months. And they weren't just writing songs. They went there with an entourage, there were activities, and so on. Another far-fetched, crazy story, in my opinion, is the Isha Tapes, which was the lead-in to the White Album. We're told that on an unknown day in May of 1968, it boggles the mind to think that they have no idea on what day in May this was done. The Beatles convened at George Harrison's bungalow, and they recorded 27 demos in one day. So these are the stories of profound and spontaneous writing abilities that I was talking about before. Yet, they fell flat with the Get Back sessions. And like I just said, the Get Back sessions, in my mind, showed what the Beatles were not capable of. To me, it was an eye-opener. To me, it was a proof point that supported my research. Okay, but I'll let you decide. All right, let's move to the next slide, which is slide 9, and let's talk about the official narrative. Okay, so let's talk about the official narrative, because there are people out there that disagree with me that will point to all of these books and these documentaries and these magazine articles and these audio clips and these photos or images that are on the internet and so on. And what they don't realize is the official narrative on just about anything that matters, is a lie. It's deception. It's fiction. It's put out there to define and shape your thoughts, your beliefs, your actions, what you do, what you don't do, how you behave. And history is loaded up with examples of well-documented official narratives, fiction and lies. We have the JFK single bullet theory. We have the start of the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It was a false flag. How many people who are listening right now did not know that the Vietnam War started based on a false flag? The Gulf of Tonkin false flag has been admitted to by the government. And what makes it even more reprehensible is 58,000 American lives were lost in Vietnam. We have 9/11 and the 19 hijackers. And what did the government do? They released the NIST report, filled with fiction. And of course, what have we been going through since March of 2020? Jabs are safe and effective. When the information that's coming out from researchers and scientists that are on the side of humanity, the information overwhelmingly shows that they are not safe and effective. And what's been going on since March of 2020 is proof positive of a well-coordinated worldwide conspiracy. But it's well documented. How many people remember this image that was put out in the media going back to 9/11. This, we were told, was bin Laden's mountain fortress. And the first box here on the left, I blew it up, and it says, the complex of caves at Tora Bora is carved 1,150 feet into a 13,000-foot mountain and can accommodate up to 1,000 people. A total lie. In fact, the British military was given the mission to go find the fortress and these caves. Did they find them? No. Why didn't they find them? Because they did not exist. But 9/11 is a well-documented event. It's a well-documented lie, is what it is. So, the Beatles narrative is a fictional story that is told to us. Just like this image here was put out. This is what the masses were told. It didn't exist. It wasn't real. But people were told it existed. And people believed it. And there's a difference between believing in something and knowing something. You want to know. So, as I mentioned, the Beatles narrative is a fictional story that is told to us. There is no direct evidence presented to prove the storyline. To embrace the story, the Beatles story, the Cinderella story, you must believe what is presented. You don't know, you have to believe what is being fed to you. And then I have people say, but Mike, there are audio clips. Audio clips prove nothing. There must be unedited, direct audio and visual interlock. Otherwise, how do you know who's actually playing on the audio or recorded track? Were you an eyewitness? You only know what you were told to believe. It goes back to the clip I showed you with Ringo Starr. People hear what they want to believe. And so they fill in the blanks. Now let's take a moment and consider some other possibilities or scenarios. So the knee-jerk reaction by many people is whenever they hear an audio or recorded track and they're told it's the Beatles, they immediately assume and believe it is the Beatles. However, is it possible George Martin recorded rehearsals of songs the Beatles learned to take out on the road, and that's what you're hearing? And the answer has to be, if you're objective and critically thinking, yes, that's a possibility. In other words, the Beatles had to learn and rehearse the songs they were taking out on the road. And when they were rehearsing, George Martin pushed the record button. Scenario number 2. Is it possible George Martin recorded vocal rehearsals accompanied by pre-recorded backing tracks? And the pre-recorded backing tracks would have been recorded by studio players. Is that a possibility? And the answer is yes. And a tie-in to the second scenario is statements that are made by fans, and I get this in the comment section every once in a while. George Harrison has a Chet Atkins style of playing. And my response back to that person is, how do you know it was not Chet Atkins on the recording? Or Vic Flick? Or Big Jim Sullivan? Or Jimmy Page? Or Eric Clapton? The answer is you don't know. Because we have no film or video interlock. You are not an eyewitness. You weren't there. You can only go by what you were told. And then you have to believe what you were told in order to embrace the narrative. Another comment that we'll come across every once in a while, especially in the comments section, in support of the Beatles writing and recording their own music, especially as it pertains to playing on the recorded tracks, is so-and-so's book documents the recording session, so what about that? And my response is, was the author at the sessions? Do they have first-hand or eyewitness experience? And if not, who or what is the source of their information? One of the things we have to keep in mind is these narratives are stories. And authors who write books or people that create documentaries, they can be part of the machine. In this case, the Beatle machine. And what's their role? Their role is to disseminate the desired narrative. So they become, in essence, the storytellers. Another scenario or possibility is the author of the book is not plugged into the Beatles, but they believe the official narrative. And so when they write their book, they are using the official narrative as their baseline or their foundation. And if we have information that we believe to be suspect contained within the official narrative, and they are tacking onto it or building upon it, then their narrative is going to contain questionable components for those of us who are questioning the official narrative of the Beatles. The bottom line is this, folks. I don't know who's plugged into the Beatle machine and who's not from an author perspective. My point is that we should be asking questions. We should not be taking the Beatles' official narrative or any narrative, whether it be JFK, the Vietnam War, 9/11, what took place starting in March of 2020, at face value. This reality is loaded up with illusion. And so the moral of the story is we should be questioning everything. And that includes the Beatles, especially considering the impact the Beatles have had on the worldwide societies. And because the social engineering was done through music, it doesn't mean that it has any less impact as far as pushing the worldwide agenda forward. The one world government, the one world religion, the new world order, whatever you want to call it. Music is a very powerful tool in the controller's toolbox. Okay, so with that, let's move to slide number 10 and let's talk a little bit about imagery. Okay, so another piece of information that people point to prove that the Beatles wrote and recorded all their own music is to look at images and say, well, look, there they are. They're in EMI Studio, so they must be writing and recording music. And of course, the problem with that is that many of these photos were staged. They were photo ops and narrative props. And I included two at the top of this slide. And these images here, and you can find them on the internet if you would like to take a closer look. These are staged photos. Okay, and again, it's to make the association. You're given the narrative, you're given the words, and now you need the imagery to bring it together so that you can fill in the blanks and you make the connection. And that's why it's done. So photos and images were part of the conditioning to associate the narrative or the story with imagery. In the image to the bottom right, many people will believe George and John could play wind instruments because they are photographed, quote, playing them. Yet, there is no proof either of them could play these instruments. And I'm just pointing this out, folks, because I get a lot of correspondences. And these are the kinds of questions that I get. People will look at an image like this on the bottom right and say, well, they were brilliant musicians. Not only could they play guitar, bass, drums, and so on, but they could play wind instruments. It's a staged photo. The only person who could play a wind instrument is the guy on the right. That's Billy. John and George, no, they could not play wind instruments. But again, people will fill in the blanks. Another example is a video I put up on my community tab, and it was a performance by the Beatles, and they were clearly playing to a backing track, which was what they did back in the day. And there were some folks that said, well, it's a backing track because they're playing on this show, and that's what they did, and that's what they still do, by the way. But that wasn't the point that I was making. The point I was making is there are so many people that will watch that video and believe it was a live performance. And what's the proof? Go to the comment section. And you will read comment after comment with people saying, oh, what an incredible performance. Aren't they unbelievable? But they were playing to a backing track. So it's the unknowing of the people. It's the unknowing of the masses, which helps in a very significant way to prop up the official narrative. And not just with the Beatles. As I've said throughout this presentation, it's with any official narrative that is out there. Take a look at what took place in March of 2020, going back to that example. How many people just fell in line and enabled what took place and what is still going on? Here's a question that I have wondered, and I'm going to throw it out to my audience, but it is a question that helps to further illustrate how people fill in the blanks and speculate. What happened to John Lennon's harmonica playing after 1964? We have two notable songs, Love Me Do and I Should Have Known Better, and I know there are other songs, but those are the two that I've picked on. If you do a search, you will find tons of speculation, which is a great example of people filling in the blanks, which in turn embellishes and distorts the existing narrative. I constantly see in the comment section, even occasionally when people write me an email, where people fabricate a narrative outside of the official narrative. I believe the reason why John and Paul did this is because, and they go on and on and on. It's all constructed in their head. It's fantasy. They don't have any knowing. They're just building upon what it is they want to believe. They are embellishing and creating their own narrative and plopping it on top of the existing narrative. And this is how it continues to grow and grow and grow. And it's all because of conditioning. It's what people want to believe. According to a cheatsheet.com article, Lennon was quoted as saying in the book Lennon Remembers, the harmonica playing, it was gimmicky to make us different. But then we have to ask ourselves, was Lennon really a competent harmonica player? The cheat sheet article, which again is sourcing Lennon Remembers, tells us that he was allegedly taught to play the harmonica by Delbert McClinton. But was it John playing on the recorded Beatle tracks, or was it a studio player like McClinton on the recorded tracks? How do we definitively know? And the answer is, we really don't. Okay, so I figured I would just throw that in there as food for thought. And with that, let's move to the next slide, slide 11. Okay, so I titled chart 11, The Official Narrative Has the Burden of Proof. And of course, if you question an official narrative, you are labeled a conspiracy theorist. And so, in essence, that's what I have done. I have questioned the Beatles' official narrative based upon many contradictory components which are tucked in underneath the Beatles' narrative. As an example, we have the 1962 Mercy Beat article from the August-September time period where it clearly states in black and white that the Beatles were flying to London to record songs that were written specifically for them, given to them by their producer George Martin. We have a number of interviews where George Martin states that he thought the Beatles' music was rubbish, they had nothing behind them, and they didn't show any songwriting skills. We have Quincy Jones going back a few years ago in a Spin magazine interview saying that the Beatles were no-playing MFers. We have Bernard Purdie, who has been saying since the 1970s that he drummed on 21 Beatles songs. And the list goes on and on and on. And as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, what got me started on asking questions was the Rubber Soul narrative. And once I took a look at that, after watching the DVD, Deconstructing Rubber Soul, I realized that something was not right. And then we have all of these stories about how the Beatles recorded 10 songs within 11 or 12 hours for the Please Please Me album, their debut album. How they recorded 14 songs in 7 days for With the Beatles. Of course, Rubber Soul, 16 songs in 30 days, starting from scratch, no backlog of music. We have the story about the Beatles going to India and writing 30 plus songs leading into the White Album. We have the story, as I mentioned earlier, about the Isha Tapes, where we are told on an unknown day in May of 1968, the Beatles recorded 27 demos at George Harrison's bungalow. And it goes on and on and on. So the official narrative is making extraordinary claims. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, to quote Carl Sagan. So one of the extraordinary claims is that Lennon and McCartney were one of the greatest songwriting teams of all time. We are told they were prolific, great, brilliant, geniuses, magical, etc. All kinds of descriptors to tell us that they were one of the greatest songwriting teams of all time. And so the question I'm asking is, where is the extraordinary evidence? And when you ask that question, what gets played back is, well, it's the official narrative. It's the words. It's the stories that we're giving you. You just need to believe, Mike. You need to have faith. Well, believing and having faith is not evidence. So when I go about my work and I take a look at something like the Beatles' timeline between 1960 through 1963, and I plug in events that the official narrative tells us took place, and then when I try to connect the dots and the dots don't connect, in other words, there are discrepancies and gaps, then it's logical to ask questions. As an example, I've covered this before, the first bullet here. We are told in the Beatles documentary, The Complete Beatles from the 1980s, which was the Beatles documentary until Anthology was released, they tell us that John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote 100 songs between 1956 and 1962. Yet as we make our way through the timeline, those 100 songs are nowhere to be found. And not only are the 100 songs nowhere to be found, but we also have unflattering comments which are made by George Martin with regard to the skill level of the Beatles, both as musicians and songwriters. So, why would I not ask questions? It's the same thing with the Rubber Soul narrative. I spent a lot of time digging into the Rubber Soul story. And the official narrative didn't make any sense. But what did make sense? Because the truth is hidden in plain sight. If you look hard enough and long enough, you will find the truth in what it is they are telling us. And I concluded that this is how it worked. All of the Beatles songs were written by outside songwriters, and the instrumental tracks were recorded by studio players. And George Martin was managing the process. When the Beatles came into the studio, their job was to sing the vocals. That was it. They were singing to pre-recorded tracks. And then once they got done singing the vocals, George Martin married the vocals with the instrumental tracks. He mixed it down, and then the record was sent off to be pressed. And I determined that this was the template throughout the entire Beatle timeline, but especially between 1962 and 1966. It existed as well during the Billy era, which was 1967 through 1970, with John Lennon and George Harrison contributing more to the songwriting content and also playing more on the recorded tracks. However, the Beatles as an entity were still using ghostwriters and studio players. So, whenever you look for the extraordinary evidence, it's nowhere to be found. It always points back to the official narrative. You just have to believe in what it is they are telling you and don't ask any questions. And it's like that with any official narrative. And if you persist in cutting across the grain and continuing to ask questions that they deem should not be asked, then you're going to be labeled a conspiracy theorist, you're going to be ridiculed, you're going to be attacked, you're going to be vilified. And this is what they do with dissenting voices. And of course, the controller's narrative is policed by the indoctrinated and brainwashed masses who are completely immersed in these official narratives. And in this case, the Beatles story, the Cinderella story. There are people who call themselves researchers in the Paul is Dead community who are completely asleep and believe the official narrative, and they will defend it to the death. The level of anger, belligerence, and nastiness that comes across my screen is unbelievable. But this is how it works with just about anything. Think about going back to March 2020 and face coverings and all that stuff. And for those that understood that the whole thing was a psychological operation, they understood that this was nothing more than social engineering and conditioning. Those of us that did not go along, we were attacked. We were attacked verbally. Some people were attacked physically. And so with this whole Paul is Dead thing, within the Paul is Dead community, there are people, I call them, as I mentioned, the Justice Leaguers, Justice for Paul McCartney. They have elevated Paul McCartney to God-like status. It goes back to the clip I played earlier where John Lennon said by 2012, Paul will be Jesus. And that is indeed what the controllers are looking to do. In fact, I would say it's what they have already done. The Beatles play a major, major role in the social engineering of society across the world to break down traditional values, to break down traditional institutionalized religions, in particular Christianity, in order to formulate a new worldwide religion that is based in paganism. It's Luciferian based. And in memoirs, this is referred to as Paulism. And that's why I call these folks Paulists, because they are in the church of the Beatles. And biological Paul McCartney is their Messiah. I mentioned in a show that I did with Billy Watson that my taking on the Beatle narrative, the entire Beatle narrative, the entire timeline from beginning to end, is no different than standing up in a Christian church and raising your hand and asking the pastor if Jesus really existed. They would bounce you out of church and look to stone you in the parking lot. And this is how many of these folks react. It's really quite amazing. You would think that more and more people would be interested in diverse ideas. They would be interested in hearing a counterpoint to what it is that they subscribe to, and then be able to have a civil discourse and to be able to be mature and have an adult discussion. But as many of us know, that type of behavior where people act in a civil way, in an adult fashion, is not easily found. It's few and far between. And so going back to the chart, so when I ask, where's the extraordinary evidence? It just continues to point back to the official narrative. It's a circular discussion. It's based in belief. It's not based in evidence or fact. And of course, there are two great quotes. One from Napoleon, history is a set of lies agreed upon. And of course, we have the quote that many of you are familiar with, history is written by the victors. And there is a debate as to who actually made that statement. Some will say it was Hermann Göring during the Nuremberg trials, and others will say it was Winston Churchill, and others will say it was neither. So, but that does not take away from what that quote is telling us. So, accepting official narratives at face value is not an exercise in critical thinking. And it doesn't matter whether it's the Beatles' official narrative or some other official narrative. Folks who make simple-minded statements like they had plenty of time to write music while presenting zero proof that that's what the lads were doing, that they were actually writing music. And we're talking about the early period. This is where most people lose their mind. It is the Bio-Paul period. They make these statements, but they do not put forth any hard proof or hard evidence at all, other than to circle back to the official narrative. And so, to me, that's guessing. And guessing is not research, and guessing is not validating the truth. People with no experience in songwriting, playing an instrument, or of the recording process should educate themselves before making declarations. An analogy that I've used in the past to describe this type of behavior is the person that knows nothing about fixing a car, and their car breaks and they need to take it down to the shop. And when they get to the shop, they want to tell the auto mechanic how to fix the car. It's the same thing. Now, critical thinking musicians, songwriters, and producers understand the writing and recording process, and therefore they understand the issues surrounding the Beatles' official narrative. Now, I should also mention that there is a segment within the music industry comprised of musicians, songwriters, and producers who know the true story. They know that the official narrative around the Beatles is fiction. But they can't say anything, because if they say something, they run the risk of damaging their careers. I have sources of mine that are in the business, and they have been in the business for decades. And they cannot say anything. They have stated to me outright that if their name gets out there and it's associated with talking about this, that their careers could be over. And that's why I tip my hat to Mike Stock. Mike is a rare breed. He stepped out and he's speaking the truth. And it's very important to remember, and I've talked about this so many times, the music and entertainment industry is a giant tool in the controller's toolbox. And if you're not questioning reality, then you are not awake. And this especially goes for those folks who are looking into the McCartney and Beatles conspiracy but don't want to touch the biopole period. They don't want to touch the Cinderella story. They want to keep that in place. And if you're one of those people and you think that you're pursuing truth, you are not. All of us need to question everything. Now, before I leave this slide, I do want to talk about what I have here on the right-hand side. This is a screen capture from the documentary produced by George Martin. And in this scene, George Martin is flashing the Masonic tell no secrets gesture. We can see his index finger to his lips. And he does this when he's questioned by Howard Goodall. And Howard is an accomplished composer himself. And Howard is asking George Martin about the complexities of certain Beatles songs and whether the Beatles were capable of such compositions. And when Howard asks the question, George Martin flashes the tell no secrets, meaning, we're not going to talk about that, Howard. We're not going to go there. And this is a very, very significant scene in the documentary. And this is why I explain to my audience that it's very important that we have at least a basic understanding of signs and symbols, which includes numbers. Because when you do, you can decode the reality. You can get underneath the deceptions and the lies and get to the truth. Now, there are two documentaries which I highly recommend, which I have talked about before. The first one is The Wrecking Crew. You can find it on YouTube. And the second one is Hired Gun. And I think you can watch that on Netflix or Amazon. The Wrecking Crew talks about the music industry and the model that was used to create music in the 1960s and the 1970s, the Beatle period. And Hired Gun picks up with the 1980s going forward into current day. So if you watch these two documentaries, you will get a very good understanding of how it all worked and how it works. And you can see I have two fingers pointing, one here and another one here with the Hired Gun documentary. But if we take a look at the Wrecking Crew, the tagline says there was only one band behind them all. Let me say that again. There was only one band behind them all. And the Beatles were not an exception. And the tagline for Hired Gun, out of the shadows and into the spotlight. Okay, so again, I highly recommend you watch both these documentaries.
The part that hurts, the real part that hurts, is that the people do not understand fixing records was a way of life. In the 60s and the 70s, it was a way of life fixing up records because 98% of the groups, self-contained groups, are not on their own albums. They are not on their own albums.
And with that, let's move to the next slide and talk about the BBC recordings and why the Beatles did so many covers. I'll give you my opinion. Okay, so a few weeks ago, I did a presentation on the Beatles and their BBC recordings, and somebody commented and asked a great question. They asked, Mike, why do you think they did so many covers for the BBC sessions? And it's about building the narrative. So my premise, Tavistock, EMI, and George Martin, because George Martin was managing the operation, needed to establish or document the historical narrative. The pre-fame backstory needed a catalog of polished songs. The existing recordings, going back to Germany and their performances throughout the UK, from a musicianship and sound quality perspective, were substandard. So they, meaning the controllers, George Martin, EMI, Tavistock, needed to buff up the pre-fame Beatles in order to make the transition story from cover band to original composition band more believable. If all they had to show for the early period before their fame were recordings like the Star Club from 1962, where it was bar and club quality, then they ran the risk of people asking, how did they go from sounding like that, meaning the pre-fame recordings, to the studio level playing that we hear on their albums like Please Please Me with the Beatles or Hard Day's Night, etc. So they needed to bridge the two stories. And the two stories being the pre-fame Beatles and then the Beatles that signed with EMI, leading into their debut album, Please Please Me. But more specifically, I believe they needed to bridge the discrepancy in the skill level of the band, the musicianship. Otherwise, like I said, people would ask questions. Well, how did they go from sounding like that and playing like that to the skill and playing that we hear on their albums? How did that happen? So I suspect what George Martin, EMI, and Tavistock did was to start using studio players on the BBC recordings, starting in 1963, going through 1965. And by doing that, they were able to bridge the skill level gap. In other words, they made the transition look less suspect from a musicianship and playing skills perspective. A listener sent me a link to 6 BBC recordings that took place in 1962 with Pete Best on drums. The sound quality is not great, but I can hear differences in skill level, especially on the drums and the guitar, which led me to believe that my suspicion that George Martin, EMI, and Tavistock inserted studio players starting in 1963 is probably what happened, and why the Live at the BBC album starts with the BBC recordings in 1963 and does not go back to 1962. At least according to the version of the BBC CDs that I have, which is Live at the BBC and Live at the BBC Volume 2. And it states that these recordings were 1963 through 1965. And what I'll do is leave a link down below in the description box with the 6 songs from the BBC sessions in 62 with Pete Best on the drums, and you can take a listen for yourself. Now, all that being said, the segue from no songwriting acumen, meaning the Beatles were not writing original songs, leading into their contract with EMI in June of 1962, to prolific songwriting skills in a very short period of time, is a glaring hole in the official narrative. But going back to the question, why so many covers on the BBC recordings, I think it was about building the narrative. It was about creating the pre-fame backstory. And as I've mentioned throughout this presentation, it's all about narrative. It's all about the words. It's all about the story. And so with that, let's move to the next slide and take a look at some screen captures from a recent concert that Billy did, and we're going to take a look at some occult symbolism. Okay, so these images came to me courtesy of Adrienne, and I want to thank Adrienne for passing them along. I haven't watched this video yet, and I will leave the link down below so you can take a look. The title of the video is Paul McCartney live in Frome, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, at the Cheese and Grain, dated 2022, so this year. And Adrienne sent over about 8 images, and I included these 4 in the presentation. So let's take a look at image number 1 at the 1 minute and 9 second timestamp. We have the Masonic Grand Pontiff pose, Billy pointing his finger, and a woman wearing the color orange. And orange in Pythagorean numerology equals 33. Moving over to the right, we have Billy doing the double sixes at the 11-second mark in the video. 45 seconds in, we have the Masonic checkerboard on Brian Ray's guitar strap. And the image to the bottom right is interesting, and we see Billy do this a lot. And I looked it up on the Thelema site. So in Thelema, there are ritual signs. There are 4 tiers from what I gather: Neophyte, Elemental, LVX, and NOX. And so this sign here that Billy's doing falls into the LVX category. And apparently the LVX signs exist to purify the individual and pave the way to receive the solar light. So again, it's about sun worship, it's about light, it's about Lucifer. Okay, so Billy continues his occult symbolism. No matter what video you watch, it's always going to be there. Now what I'm going to take you through are some, quote, McCartney and Stanchel compares, but the best part of this is 2 videos that came from the channel 5 Tone 10. I will leave the link down below. The content creator's name is Alex. He sent the links over to me where he compares, quote, McCartney and Stanchel mannerisms. It's quite an eye-opener. And I'm going to show you both of Alex's videos after we do some image compares. Okay, so let's move to slide number 17. Okay, so before I get started, for those of you who don't know, I did an entire presentation on Stanchel, and the link will be down below in the description box. And these stills, these images that I'm going to take you through, many of them are in that presentation. So for some folks, this is a refresher. For other folks, this is brand new. Now, many people do not see the connection between Billy as McCartney and Billy as Vivian Stanchel. And many times I'll be asked, well, wasn't Stanchel this tall, lanky, skinny guy and around 6'3"? Well, the answer is there was a version of Stanchel who was tall, lanky, and 6'3". That version was a man by the name of Victor, and that is the Vivian Stanchel that passed away back in the 1990s. So we have at least 2 Vivian Stanchels. One is Billy, who played the role in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes. We had Victor, who, to the best of my knowledge, never played with the Bonzos. He was outside the Bonzos. He was on Billy's payroll because Billy needed his McCartney and Stanchel character to be able to coexist. It's like the Batman and Bruce Wayne dilemma. You never see them in the same room together. So when Billy hired Victor to play the role of Stanchel, then the 2 characters can be in the same room together. Although, I don't know if that ever happened. And there's a possibility that there were others that played the role of Vivian Stanchel because the character was always made up with cosmetics, wigs and latex and all of that. And another person that I suspect may have played a version of Stanchel, which would mean he would be a 3rd individual, was a person by the name of Greg Masters, who was in the band Idle Race going back into the 1960s, and that was a band that Jeff Lynne was in. But I can't confirm that, and it's just conjecture, but it's possible. Okay, but for sure there was Billy and Victor. So in the first slide, this is Billy doing his Paul McCartney character, and here's Billy doing his Stanshall character. And if you take a look, you can see that the shape of the face is the same. The teeth, the mouth are the same. The eyes are the same. So this is Billy. This is Billy playing McCartney, and this is Billy doing his Stanshall character. And in Memoirs, what he tells us, when he played Stanshall, he lowered his eyebrows. And we can see him doing that here. And when he played his McCartney character, he raised his eyebrows. And of course, by doing so, would change the facial features somewhat. But for me, I can clearly see the same person. So you guys let me know in the comment section. Here's another image from my Stanshall presentation. The image on the far left is Billy. He's wearing a wig. He's donning latex. And if we move to the right, this is him as Stanshall. And if we take both images and we lay them on top of each other, we can see that the shape of the face, the eyes, the nose, the mouth is a perfect fit. And of course, we can see the hair is higher on the McCartney character because, as I mentioned, he's wearing a wig. Okay, so let's move over to slide number 19 now. And here's Billy as an older Paul McCartney. And here's Billy as his Stanshall character. And I don't know about you, but I see the same person, only he's older here on the left. Take a look at the structure of the face, even the eyes to a certain degree. The hair, this is the same person. And let me move this down here for a bit. If we look at the far right picture on the top row, we have the left hand side of the image is Billy as Stanshall. And that's mirrored with Billy from Let It Be. And it's a pretty good match, if you ask me. We're going to see differences in the nose because Billy has had surgery on his nose, and so that's going to alter what the nose looks like. But you can see the mouth lines up. The forehead lines up. We can even see where the lines in the forehead. It's a little more difficult to see on the McCartney side of the image, but it's there. Look at the hairline. Okay, so that's another image. And if we move down to the second row, the image on the far left is the same image we see as the split screen here on the top right. And if we move over to the next image, we have Billy in his McCartney role. And here we can see it's the same person. Look at the eyes, even the eyebrows, because even though he's raising them here, it's not as arched as he might do otherwise. The nose, even though he has had surgery to fix the nose to look more like Paul McCartney and less like his natural nose, when he scrunches his face, we can still see the resemblance in the nose. Look at the chin, under the lip. Okay, this is the same guy. These two people are the same guy. And then we have this image in the center on the bottom row. And again, it's the split screen or mirroring comparison. And again, I don't know. Seems to be the same person to me. And then this is the image from the first slide I showed, the first compare slide. It takes some time, I admit, to take a look at it because it's very, very difficult to get your head wrapped around that this is going on. But once you understand what they can do with surgery, cosmetic surgery, and latex, it will fall in place. Now let's move to slide number 20. And here I have a comparison between Billy's version of Vivian Stanshall with the Bonzo. That's on the left. That's Billy's Viv. And to the right is Victor, who I refer to as Street Viv. Now, when people ask me, well, wasn't Vivian Stanshall tall, lanky, skinny, and 6'3"? That's this guy here. And if you take a look at them, side by side, they are clearly not the same person. Victor, again, is the guy that Billy put on his payroll so that Billy's McCartney and Stanshall character could coexist. Okay, so I take you into more detail in my presentation on Stanshall, and I show you a number of images that have to do with Victor, and I compare those images with the version of Stanshall that Billy played. Okay, so let's take a look now at the videos from Alex. And Alex's YouTube channel is 5tone10. And I'll put a link down in the description box. Please subscribe to his channel. And I'm going to have to make sure I have the volumes muted because the songs that Alex uses are Bonzo Dog Band songs, and I don't want YouTube to block the videos because of copyright. So I'll just mute it, and let's take a look. I will tell you that it's an excellent piece of work, and Alex is extremely observant. So here we have his McCartney character running out, then his Stanshall character. Look at his arms. Billy doing the same thing, that wheel motion with his arms. He's doing it again here from Magical Mystery Tour. All right, let's go back and take a look at that. It's really obvious with this clip here from Magical Mystery Tour. Okay, so what Alex is showing you there is how Billy holds his hands and how he stands. So let's take a look at that again. Watch his hands. He clasps the hands. The same thing there as McCartney. And there he is with that motion that he does with his hands. Very good, Alex. Let's move to video number 2 now. Again, let me make sure it's muted. It's the same thing, so take a look at the mannerisms. Okay, so it's that head bobbing that Billy does. Stanshall's the one with the scarf, the yellow scarf. Watch his head. And there's Billy playing bass on the rooftop, bobbing his head. That's another thing I want to point out, by the way, not to digress here. Some people think that it's biological Paul in the Let It Be movie on the rooftop, which boggles my mind because Billy and Paul McCartney do not play bass the same way. Their mannerisms and how they hold the bass and how they move with the bass is completely different. So that is not biological Paul on the rooftop of Let It Be. And now I'll go back to Alex's video. Okay, so what we have is Stanshall up front, and watch him lifting his legs and doing his little dance, okay? Oh, what do we have here? And again, the way he holds his hands. That's a very strange image of Billy, by the way. It looks like a ton of latex on his face. Okay, so that's it. Both these clips are on Alex's channel, 5-Tone 10. Please take the time to subscribe. So Alex, thank you very much for sending the videos over and then giving me permission to put them into the presentation. It's greatly appreciated. Okay, so let's move to slide number 22, and I want to talk about something that came up in an interview that Mark Devlin did with another researcher, and I want to kind of set the record straight. Okay, so let's go there now. Okay, so as a backdrop to the next two slides, Mark Devlin sent me a link to an interview that he did with a researcher that I have had on my show, and I've actually done several hours of content with this person, and this individual gets into the cult aspects of the Beatles. So I told Mark that when I had a chance, I would take a listen to the interview. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation, I'm going to be on Mark's podcast in the beginning of October, and we're going to talk about the Beatles. So when I took a listen to the show that Mark did with this individual, they had dropped my name. They were being passive-aggressive, in my opinion, toward me, and making certain statements with regard to where I do not go with my work and why it is I have not had them back on my show. And what this person was discussing with Mark is the deep state's involvement in the death of Paul McCartney. It was a ritual sacrifice, and then he goes on to say that the person from the deep state that was involved with the death of Paul McCartney was Maxwell Knight, who was a British spy master. So as I'm listening to this, I'm kind of getting a bit of a chuckle, because if I go back to my 2018 presentation, in fact, it was uploaded November of 2018, I talked about both scenarios. I talked about the possibility of Paul McCartney's death being the result of a ritual sacrifice, which is a long-standing discussion point I have presented over the years, and I have talked about this even prior to this person coming onto my show. And in that presentation, the Beatles, Paul McCartney, and the Grand Illusion, I also spoke about the possibility of deep state involvement in the death of Bio Paul. And the deep state scenario came to me from this source who told me he was a first-person eyewitness to the conversation that took place at an event in the 1990s that included the military-industrial complex, intelligence, and Silicon Valley types. And he relayed to me that there was this person in the room, and he was talking to maybe 3 or 4 other people, and my source was there. And my source explained that this person at this event said that the car crash, the accident, was orchestrated. It was supposed to happen, and that the deep state was there to ensure that he died. So in other words, if the car crash didn't kill him, they were going to make sure that he died. And then back in September of 2021, a year ago, I did a presentation based on a clue in the 2021 version of Memoirs, and did a video discussing the possible involvement of British spy master Maxwell Knight in the sacrificial death of Paul McCartney. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this is because the guest that Mark had on his show made it sound like he was presenting some new revelation. And that would be okay, except, like I said, he was name-dropping my name, taking some swipes passive-aggressively, and then making a statement that maybe this stuff is too dark And that's the reason why he hasn't been back on the show. And none of that is true, because I have presented the possibility, the strong possibility, that Paul McCartney's death was a ritual sacrifice. And I have discussed, going back 4 years ago, the possibility of deep state involvement. And going back a year ago, I spoke about Maxwell Knight. Now, I questioned Maxwell Knight's direct involvement in the murder of Paul McCartney, if Maxwell Knight was involved in the death of Paul McCartney, because Maxwell Knight was suffering from health issues. He had heart problems. And what I had said in my presentation going back last year was, perhaps if he was involved, he was in an oversight capacity. Okay, so I don't like getting into this stuff. I don't like talking about this stuff. But with this particular individual, because I really do like to keep things cordial and professional, the truth of the matter is I gave this person their break. If it wasn't for this person coming onto my show, in all likelihood, nobody would know who he is. And so I have to say it's a bit disappointing. And the reason why he has not been back on the show is twofold. One, I determined that he and I were not a good fit. Secondly, there comes a point where the research has diminishing returns. In other words, the research begins to tail off and there's no new discovery. And of course, I'm making that determination because it's my channel and it's my podcast. Okay, so I talked about this in another video, and I have explained my position on dark occult content. So to reiterate and to go into more detail, this channel, my channel, does not major in dark occult content. It's not healthy from a mental, emotional, and physical state of well-being. As with most topics, eventually there is a point of diminishing returns. And this is what I was talking about in the previous slide. As an example, the content becomes repetitive. If this happens, the topic will be tabled. This channel will not show gruesome images purporting to be biological Paul. Such images, along with being extremely disturbing, cannot be confirmed and therefore are speculative in nature and won't be presented. This channel does not subscribe to turning over every dark stone under the guise of, quote, research. For example, does showing the act of pedophilia become a requirement to know such behavior is repugnant? No. For this channel, the basic and general concepts of occultism and ritual, including sacrifice, is sufficient. Anyone wishing to dive deeper into the darkness can do so on their own. I don't swim in the dark, murky waters of the occult, folks. I don't. It's not good to be there. In other videos, I've explained, never play with Ouija boards because you have no idea what you might be interacting with. Don't do it. So I'm not going down this path. I'm not going to take a dive off the cliff into the dark occult waters. And I just want to be very, very clear about that. My objective with this conspiracy is to make people aware of the mechanics and how these types of psychological operations are carried out. What are the components? How are they pulled off? And the McCartney and Beatles conspiracy ranks right up there with some of the top psychological operations of all time. And that's where I do my work. Okay, so I just want to make it perfectly clear that there are certain areas I won't go because I have determined there's no need to go there in order to understand what's going on or what went on. Okay? And so with that, let me go to the last slide, and I'm going to talk about defending copyrights, trademarks, and privacy. Okay, so this is the last chart, defending copyrights, trademarks, and privacy. And I am addressing those out there who are inclined not to do the right thing. Intellectual property is real. Privacy is real. Sage of Quay is a trademark. All Sage of Quay and my Paul is Dead channel presentations are copyrighted. Fair use is a legal defense, not a right. YouTube's privacy policy will be aggressively enforced. Infringements will be pursued and may result in legal action against the infringing party. Okay? So, it's unfortunate, folks, that I have to address this type of thing, but as you have probably guessed, I need to address it. And so with that, that concludes the presentation, my friends. The comment section is open. You guys and gals have a great day. We will talk soon, and thanks very much for listening.